I've had to lay off friends, had to lay off people that I've cared about. And I know that that's very hard. We're tied to our jobs pay our bills, but do not make your job your personality because once it's gone, what can you do?
What do you think is like the right way for a company to make an individual redundant?
First, the thing I want to say and like letting them know. A lot of times people will talk about how their manager shouldn't say, they're sorry or X, Y, and Z. If you say you're sorry, it indicates that you're doing something wrong. And so it opens up a room for people to sue. And so a lot of that's going to always be eliminated by legal.
From like a legal perspective, what rights do I have as the person being made redundant?
One, pause. Do not sign anything yet. You're emotionally hijacked. You're in an emotional moment. You do not have to make any decision that day. I would say the next thing is
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Open to Work podcast. I'm joined today by Morgan Williams, the CEO and founder of Peak HR. Morgan, welcome to the Open to Work podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here.
So as is tradition, and it's a tradition that I think we're going to keep going with until we receive feedback otherwise, to introduce yourself, tell me about yourself as if you were in an interview.
If I was in an interview, I would probably say it would probably be an HR interview. And I would say that my desire was actually not to be in HR at all. I started from the psychology aspect, and I actually wanted to be a psychiatrist. And I think that through going through the programs and everything else, I was really learning that I love the way people interact, the scientific approach behind it, just changing just little different things, how impactful that could be. And that's essentially how I try to use that scientific approach in how I do all of my work. Humans are psychology and the sociology of a group. And so when you can combine those dynamics together, it's really impactful and gets to literally the core of who we are as beings when it comes down to empathy, as well as even just how we get rewards and recognition at work.
Amazing. I've got so many little follow-ups on that, but from a kind of a professional perspective, why don't you give us a little story of kind of what you've been doing for the last few years and then maybe introduce us to Peak HR.
Yeah, started in tech, was a recruiter. I literally tell people I've probably done in every HR job, as well as worked in every industry or touched it in some type of way. I've worked for unicorns before. I've worked for the government, finance, retail, you name it. I've definitely been in those spaces. And I think it's from being in all of those, seeing different ways that companies interact. I think also like being in organizations that have more money than God and being in organizations that are super broke is very intriguing of how you decide to do rewards and recognitions or really anything with HR, which is kind of giving me a great capacity for orgs whenever we're in this type of economy to operate and to understand how to run really lean or expansive. And so I think that that's been something that's been very exciting about my career, as well as doing some consultancy. I think that after a while, I really just started thinking about my own growth in HR. I think the last 2 years have been pretty difficult, and that became the creation of Peak HR, utilizing mentors to kind of teach real practical HR skills instead of just certifications. And also building a community. I think we've been really isolated. And so that was something that was really important to me with people that are on the same page as you. So, yeah.
Okay. And so the main topic that I kind of wanted to bring you on today is to talk about redundancies. And it's not a pleasant topic to talk about, but again, it is one of these emotional weight-bearing jobs that HR is sort of kind of pushed into and should be the ones that kind of lead the charge on this. But lots of people who are listening to this podcast will have been impacted, myself included, by a reduction in force in their business over the last 2 years. And it's caused a huge portion of the workforce to go to now be looking for their next job. And I thought it was important to create space to talk about like what is happening behind the scenes here. What is a redundancy? Like, how does it work? Like, and very few people I think could articulate that and get into that detail as well as you. So why don't we start with the story of, and obviously without giving any specifics, but like what does a business go through to have to trigger the decision to make someone redundant?
Yeah. I also want to say, just for the US, redundancy and RIFs are the same thing, just in case we have, more US speakers. With that, there's a lot of metrics that you're looking at consistently. And I think one of the things is revenue and profit. You're forecasting, you're looking at the disruptions and things that are going to change. And those things are constantly being monitored by finance. And there are certain triggers, so to speak, when you get under certain thresholds that you either may not be able to pay for certain commitments, whether that be vendors, whether that be employees. Whether that be, if you said that you were going to do a 4% on 401k, like that's all funds that the business has to allocate over. And so when those get to certain thresholds, basically they're triggers and they can kick off certain things that need to change the landscape. COVID was a massive trigger that made people have to really reprioritize. We were seeing a lot of drops in supply chains. We were seeing a lot of issues. When it came down to that, on top of that, there was a big unknown, and that's hard to forecast an unknown. And so I would say that's the first thing. All these businesses are going to look at it differently. It can be very intricate. If it's a larger enterprise organization, if it's a scrappy, lean startup, they're probably looking at this much more likely, more frequently, because every decision impacts that bottom line. And so that's really what I would say is there's vast things that they are pulling on. I think it's also what are your business priorities and what do you actually need to pay for? Every employee comes with a certain set of benefits that cost money. Every employee also comes with tooling and everything. So when you're thinking even about your hiring forecast of do we actually have enough to bring these people on and to have them here? If that was into your pipeline, it is something to kind of consider on how you're making decisions. And if you can't afford for these people to all come into the organization, what does that mean? Where do you need to start making cuts and what does that look like?
And I guess just to paint a picture, how many rifts have you managed or been a part of through your career?
I was a part of the Macy's layoffs, and that's probably to date the largest one that I've ever done. There was about 20,000 impacted at that time. Yeah, it was a very massive number, and it was through a lot of iterations, and we can have a chance to talk about that. I would say the other probably larger one that I did was Topshop. I closed down all of the locations in the U.S. and several other small ones at different startups or companies or whatever the case may be. And I think doing it in all of these different companies has allowed me to also see, once again, the multitude of ways that they're done. And I think that's something I love to talk about because I think people always think it's just like this is one size fits all. And I've seen it done so many different ways that I do think people should be aware of that.
Yeah, and I think the kind of the point to bring back to there is that and maybe we'll talk about this. Like, is this personal? Like,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
that's a
mm-hmm.
question that is on so many people's
Yeah.
minds. Like, is it about you as an individual, and how often is that the case, if it is?
Yeah, love to talk about that. The first thing I would always tell job seekers, no, it's not personal. Completely take yourself out of that. And I know that that's very hard. We're tied to our jobs pay our bills, but do not make your job your personality. Like that is the one thing I will always tell any and everybody because once it's gone, what can you do? Great quote that I found on Twitter at one point. It was basically, if you had to describe yourself without saying your job, where you're from, or anything else, how would you describe yourself? And it gets you to lean into your passions and things that aren't that can change. And I think that that's why we're in such an issue right now is people just see their jobs in so much of their identity. And when we have to get outside of that, we are so much more than our jobs. When it comes down to the positions and how that relates in regards to, if there is a risk, I'll give you an example of a system that I had used before. Basically, we had managers answer and fill out these surveys. We input it into the system and it spit out who the people were going to be laid off. Managers had no idea. They received the list. And so I like to say that because I think sometimes people are like, they chose me. And like, not saying it can't happen.
Mm.
But what I do want to say is I want to expose people to other things that can happen. And so in that situation, the managers had no idea. Yet they were about to be having these conversations with people that it went through an algorithm. And we're all used to seeing social algorithms and everything else like that. It did the same thing and it had different weight factors and triggers through their own ACP and intellectual property that was there. But with that being said, it just shot out a list of the people that needed to be laid off. And so that's why I like to show that other side of managers were shocked then. Sometimes they saw the list and sometimes it was, the people that they really loved or cared about, favorite employees, and they didn't understand. And so that's another side of the demographic. Sometimes even the people delivering news, sometimes it's news to them as well. And
Mm.
even on the other side of being an HR professional, we often have to lay ourselves off as well.
Yeah.
So I think that that's something to consider. Sometimes the person even laying you off may be laid off later.
And I think there's a tension, I guess, between whether or not we
Mm-hmm,
want it to be business and whether or not we want it to be personal. Like, because I think, like, listening to you there, you're like, wow, that's pretty callous. Like, they literally put it into an algorithm. The algorithm made the decision, and there was like no
mm-hmm,
thought about like the human behind it. And I think there's a lot of the, like,
mm-hmm.
human centric redundancy. I think is important. But then when you make it human centric, it becomes about you,
Personal.
and I
Yeah.
think that it does become personal, and it becomes about who you like. or what's
Mhm.
your relationship with that person starts to influence the decision making. And so you kind of can't have both. Like, it either has
Mhm.
to be a business decision that you can emotionally detach yourself from, or
Mhm.
it's intrinsically personal and about you specifically. But it's not, it's very rarely both of those things.
100%. I would definitely agree. I've seen it on the other side of, having the list going through, thinking about the future of the business. Once again, what is that going to look like? Are we moving to smaller teams? Not the best example, but Amazon cutting out managers, like that would be something that was a strategic decision, made way long before they've ever even mentioned it. That you're thinking about in a whole talent demographic. And like sometimes that is the case because you are building smaller pod teams or you're going to open another HQ
Mm.
across. So what does that look like? We're going to either need to move some people or start hiring some people in other divisions.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to call out as well that just because a business is like making redundancies isn't because like that business is failing or like not making
Mm-hmm.
lots of money. And then there's a couple of layers to this. One is that it's totally reasonable for a business to restructure a team and say, look, actually, we are thinking that this strategy that we've invested in here is not quite working. And it's not going
Yeah.
to, and this isn't the future direction we're going to take our business. And so as a result, we're going to like eliminate this team or reduce the size of this team or whatever reason. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not because the business could be massively profitable, but it could be that they've gone a strategic, and that was how I was impacted in my riff, is that they decided they were going to eliminate this leadership layer around the business, and that ultimately impacted me as well. So Alderson James are one of the leading people and talent agencies. Since 2013, they've been responsible for over 1,000 people and talent hires, including one in a company that I used to work at. They helped me hire my head of technology TA. So I know the guys there pretty well. They've been responsible for scaling some of the most innovative companies in the UK and the EU. Also recently just launched in the US. So even folks in your neck of the woods now, James, can get involved for contingent, retained, and executive search. And they also now do embedded through AJX. So they can do it all. So talking about redundancy specifically, though, so we're a business that
Mm-hmm.
has decided to make a reduction in force or make a redundancy. What is the process, assuming we're in the US, that
Mm-hmm.
you have to go through to officially make that happen?
Yeah, understand what is the number. Like, what is the number we're trying to get to? That's going to involve salaries, benefits, everything else that we need to know that we as a business need to get under. And that's going to allow you to understand how to calculate that. What are we looking at the transitions between the business? Are there innovative products or whatever that we're going to slash right now? Kind of what we were talking about before, products of like, actually, we can't afford this product launch. Okay, cool. At that point, that team is likely going to be put on the RIF list just because it's an easy headcount to take off. On top of that, it just makes sense. It aligns with the business priorities. I would say the next thing is going over of like what are the groups that maybe aren't nearly as efficient or they are overloaded with talent. Do we see huge discrepancy in pay? I mean, I think sometimes people ask this a lot to me of like they're a great performer and everything else like that. Sometimes because you are a high performer and have a high wage, if they have to get under a certain number, that can include you. And so that's why I always say, like, don't ever look at somebody that's been laid off and to say, you know, they weren't great or they weren't anything. Sometimes it is because you have such a high salary and you're doing great in your job that we just have to get below that number.
Mm.
And unfortunately, that is what happens. So that's a myth that I usually love to course correct because I think a lot of people get stuck there. After that, once you figure out kind of going department through department of, what does this look like? Where are the efficiencies? Or where do we just have talent that we just, need to shed? I think that's when it allows us to really kind of start formulating the plan and what that's going to be. And so the next step is like notifying state officials, warn notices, looking because now we actually know where those talent pools are and how many numbers. Before you don't necessarily know, you have a figure, a budget
Mm.
number,
And so
not a
let's
headcount number.
double let's that was a lot of information and it was super interesting, but I want to unpack it a little bit more for the listener.
Yeah.
So basically we're in the most simplified version, finance has said, or for one reason or another, let's assume that it's because we're missing our number as a business, and as a result, we're going to make some reductions in our team size. We need to get our total headcount number under this number, under one, $100 million or whatever the number is in order to be able to continue operating in the way that we're going, because we're losing too much money and we're not making enough money, and so our burn rate is too high. And so you will work with the finance team and the business leaders to identify who the relevant people are, the relevant teams that should be most impacted on this, and then come up with a financial number that gets us under that threshold,
Mhm.
basically, that you've been given by finance.
Yep,
In the most
100%.
absolutely most simplified version, and there's a million different ways that you can do
There's
this,
a
but that's
million different variables that go into here, of course. But I
yeah,
would say that's probably the most simplified
yeah.
way. Yeah.
And so, what is your role in HR in all of this?
Ooh, I've worn a lot of different hats. I mean, I've been the one that sent out the warn notices. I've been the one that's ran the things through the algorithm. I've been the one that's, making the list. I've been the one that's in the conversations. I've had the conversations on the other side of the table, so I've literally worn every single hat within this process. And I think that's what's allowed me to be able to talk about it so eloquently, because there's so many different phases through it.
Mhm.
And that's something I really want people to feel empowered in a moment that can really be very traumatic, honestly.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point that I think we should pause on, and perhaps should have done at the top of the show. But the reason why we're going into this is to empower you with information, right? This is quite a traumatic process, and I think that by destigmatizing it and taking away the black hole of information, and hopefully it empowers you and from understanding and data and information to engage with what this is. And kind of hopefully the message that you're starting to hear is, it's not about you. It's a super business decision, and this is like a really clearly documented process, and it's actually pretty intense to go through as a business. And that obviously doesn't minimize the negative impact that it has on your life. But what this is a business process that is technical and documented and cold in its own way, kind of
Mhm.
as it should be to a certain extent. And we'll talk about the human side of this in a second. But we want to unpack this so that you can better engage with this, and hopefully find it kind of less scary, perhaps. But you can engage with it in a different way. We are delighted to be sponsored by Metaview. Metaview is the AI assistant for the interview process. Their AI records and transcribes hiring conversations like interviews, intakes, and debriefs, and then provides a perfectly summarized note of everything that was discussed. That means that you can focus on creating human connections with candidates during calls and save time on the busy work of cleaning up notes after every interview. I've spoken to so many recruiters and recruiting leaders who are loving using Metaview across their organizations. It's saving them time, but it also means that they have more data to make better decisions. So for every candidate and every pipeline, hiring teams can now make confident and informed decisions, and recruiters can finally take control of the interview process. The impact on candidate experience is also massive. Since recruiters don't have to worry about taking notes in the moment, they can really focus on being present and engaged with you. Forward-thinking recruiters at high-performing organizations like Brex, HelloFresh, and Quora are all leveling up their interviews with Metaview. So head on over to metaview.ai/open to work to get started for free on your first 5 calls. And so, what do you think is the right way for a company to make an individual redundant? And I guess that's kind of comes down to the package and the support that they might be
Mhm.
given, or it comes to the actual moment of letting them know.
Yeah, I mean, I think first, the thing I want to say, and letting them know, a lot of times people will talk about how their managers shouldn't say, they're sorry or X, Y, and Z. There's so many legal obligations in that conversation that I just want people to know of, if you say you're sorry, it indicates that you're doing something wrong. And so it opens up a room for people to sue. And so a lot of that's going to always be eliminated by legal,
Yeah,
and those are
I want
things to really think about.
and I really want to double click on this, because these conversations are almost entirely are scripted when they're done
Yep.
in at scale across a business, and
Hmm.
that's why often you're let know by email, because the business
Hmm.
doesn't trust that managers can deliver this face to face with you or over the phone with you and not leave them exposed to legal liability. It's
Yep.
falls into the same category of the reason why you didn't get feedback from that interview was because they
That is their
legally didn't
problem.
trust that the person was going to be able to give you feedback in a way that was not going to expose them to risk. And it's the
Hmm.
exact same with this conversation. So I think just take that, they probably, what's happening on the side there, having, as someone who's done this before, as one had to make
Hmm.
someone redundant, that person desperately wants to wrap their arms around you and support
Yeah.
you, and actually it would make it worse, and it will be harder for everyone involved.
Yeah, and a lot of confusion, and so I think that's one of the things that I always want to say. It's, conversation that they feel is like not personal or whatever the case. A lot of times that's legal, coming in there and stepping in and trying to provide. Do I think that there are spaces to where you can? Yes, I do. But I also think that that depends on your business style and the type of people that you're employing. Is that a part of your culture? Because if you if you do this at the end, it's going to feel very odd if they haven't exhibited that anywhere else within the business. And so I think that I've also seen that different approaches when it comes down to that,
Mhm.
just due to how a business culture kind of reacts in that way. And also, there's the whole theme of, do we have a messaging after and tell employees, or do we tell them why? Like, there's always this big discussion of, do we tell them about the group? Do we just see the people disappear from Slack or Teams or whatever the case is? There's so many business decisions and discussions that are going into the why, the how, and what the potential effect is going to be.
From like a legal perspective, what rights do I have as the person being made redundant? I know this will like vastly vary by state, but
Yeah.
maybe you can give us like an example, like if you're in this state, this is generally speaking what how it plays out for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll use for the most part just basic US. There are going to be some different states in there, but just kind of the basic US. One, pause. Do not sign anything yet. You know what I'm saying? Like, don't do that. You're one, emotionally hijacked. You're in an emotional moment. Take it back. You can have a lawyer read that. It usually says that in the paperwork.
Mhm.
You have time. You can usually ask for an extension if you need it. And so just because those things are said on this paperwork, remember there are rights that you are entitled to. You can ask for that. Most people aren't going to say no, especially if you're saying you're having a lawyer, somebody else read the paperwork, to help to assist you to come up with the decision. So that's the first thing I would say, is like literally just pause. Like you do not have to make any decision that day. I would say the next thing is, if you're over 40, you have even longer to decide before you sign. Read the paperwork really, really clearly. What are you giving away? You know what I'm saying? Is it your IP? Is it, different things that you've contributed to projects? Like, always ask. You never know what can be negotiated. I've seen people get their laptop computers just because they asked. They don't have another computer, they want to apply for a job. I have seen people get different benefits paid, Cobra, whatever the case may be, just because they asked. My biggest thing is, you can ask. The answer can be no, but if you don't ask, you'll never know. And so that's where I would also empower you, is to talk with somebody. Lawyers typically have some averages, for you, but also understand what you are signing. And when you're signing that paper, are you signing your rights away? That's part of the reason why the EEOC has gotten more involved, because there was so much information of, we will give you severance if you sign this, basically saying nothing about the company doing all of this,
Yeah.
even though you may have been treated horribly. And so, we're seeing definitely some changes on the legislation front, but think about your age, think about your demographic, think about the different things that have happened. If you do feel that it's unfair, even more of a reason to talk to a lawyer. If you think
Yeah.
that there's some nuances, with age, sex, race, whatever the case may be. Because you may have a potential case, and there are contingency lawyers that can take that on. There's the EEOC here, but don't feel that you just have to sign right then and there. I think that's the biggest thing that I want to tell people. You can ask for a deadline, or a renewed deadline, or an extension. You can ask for different benefits. You can opt out of things and say, instead of
Mhm.
this, maybe can I just, and you were going to be paying for outplacement, but actually I don't really need outplacement. Like, I prefer an extra month on my benefits. There's different things that people are able to do. At the end of the day, may the company say no? Yeah, they may say no, but it's the may that I challenge you on, because they may say yes.
When I'm listening to you here, um, the main thought going through my head is they're treating you like a business decision. You have to treat this like a business decision. You know, take your
Mhm.
emotion. I know this is an emotional moment. Like
Very
that's
emotional moment.
completely true. It's a super emotional moment. That's why you should get a lawyer involved. That's why you should
Yep.
try and get representation. Have someone commercially who is not attached to this guide you
Hmm.
through it. And I've seen some of the most challenging negotiations I've seen from my friends and family are
Hmm.
when they don't have a lawyer who is
Yep.
sitting next to them, and their like friend or their husband or whatever is like guiding them through, or their wife is like guiding them and telling them what to do, and you should do this and you should do this. Like, no, strip it back, give it to a lawyer, tell them what you want and what you're willing to trade off for, and let them do the work. Because that is
Yeah.
literally, and in the UK, you are legally obliged, you have to have a lawyer review your settlement agreement to make sure you understand it. And they have to be able,
Hmm.
and they have to sign a document to say that you acknowledge that you have understood the terms of your settlement, and that is part of what you are negotiating with in the UK specifically. And so use that. It's an essential part of
100%.
your redundancy moment?
I would say, something that spurred up to me when you were saying this is a business decision. I would say, think of this as how you were coming into the business, thinking about what you were going to negotiate business, like whether it was flexible time off, PTO, benefits. Think of it as you're exiting the company too. There may be that opportunity. And so just kind of keeping that open mindset of things that you would either prefer instead of this bucket or that bucket, there could be an opportunity. Will it always be? I'll be quite honest. No, but I have seen some
Yeah.
amazing things that come out of people just asking.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously I can't go into my settlement package, but I did receive things that were non-traditional as part of my exit package, in addition to the my standard stuff. So like it can happen, and that was all managed through a lawyer who was communicating entirely with the business on my behalf, because I imagine that I would have said some other things if I was communicating with the
And
business.
that's the reason. It's so emotional. A lawyer can detach that. You can tell your lawyer, just tell me when you need me to respond to. So you're not, it's very emotional, and I think sometimes you can get so heavy into that and like every single word, let somebody else handle it. That's not in that, emotionally hijacked state. It's going to be so much better for you.
Yeah, I have a couple more questions, and then we're almost done,
Oh,
I
yeah.
promise. But the main one is you've managed now all these different layoffs. You've supported, I guess, thousands of people in exiting businesses now. How do you feel going through this? How are you feeling?
I'm so happy to have this question. It's very difficult. And I don't think a lot of people think about that from the HR perspective. And it's not that I'm asking for pity or anything else like that, but I've had to lay off friends. I've had to lay off people that I've cared about. And that's tough. You see the names on the list, keeping the things confidential. It's very difficult as you're kind of going through these, especially if it's like a years long process. It's even harder, to kind of hold this information, which is why I was saying having a smaller tight team is very key because it helps with leaks. I would say the other portion is just kind of how you were saying before, like your manager, somebody else may want to hug you in the conversation. It's very real. I've had a lot of managers right after the call just cry and to call me or talk, and we would talk about how difficult a decision it was. Usually try to get some time for the next day. There's a lot of emotions in here, not just from that side. And I think that's the other portion that I do want to open up because people don't see that. But it is really real. It's a grueling feeling. And sometimes these are people that you've mentored, you've grown, and now you're having to do that. And it feels very challenging. I would say the other thing is remember that I see so many people kind of stop contact after somebody's been laid off. You don't have to do that. This is really the time that most people need you most. And
Mm.
even if they may reject it initially, you can always continue to reach out. Like it can be very isolating, and sometimes they're scared to reach out to you. They don't know what's happening on the other side. So just think of that, and it's a way of that you can also support people whether you're still in the organization or not. There's a lot of emotions, and sometimes people want to be with just somebody that they know.
Yeah, I really love that, because my kind of follow-on question is, there is a survivor's guilt, and I'm sure that
Yep.
people who have been made redundant are like, yeah, F them, like they get to keep their job, and I'm on the job market. I don't really care about that, but it is real. It is really
Very
real,
real.
especially if there are massive redundancies happening. To what extent, what can you do you think, as an employee remaining in that business to support the individuals and empathize with the individuals who are leaving?
Yeah, open your networks up. You know what I'm saying? Like I think we get so close sometimes, and ask them if you have a really great relationship with them. Ask them, would you be okay? Sometimes people want it to be anonymized. If I know this person, they have the skill set. I've been seeing a lot of people utilize that. I saw some people do social Saturdays. Like there's just so many ways, but I think also just keeping communication. Like people feel very isolated during this time, and that can be mentally just debilitating. Like
Yeah,
it can really affect you in ways that I can't even quantify. And so I would say reaching out, having conversations, like if they don't want to talk about it, it's completely fine. Just having a normal conversation about something else, because like people do need community. They do need people that they feel that are there that care for them. And this is a time where a lot of people are questioning themselves, their abilities, their talent. And so having somebody that's just there as a friend, that can mean so much more than you know. It's not always about trying to make sure you secure them the next job. You may not be able to, and that could just be the reality of things. But that support or your network or other friends or just kind of keeping your ear open or liking their posts when they're looking or whatever the case may be, that can get them their next job. So like those micro actions can actually be macro actions to that
yeah.
individual.
This kind of element of community, I think, is such a key piece. And obviously, we are both like invested in the community, right? Because we see the value in it. But our workplace is one of our biggest communities, and so when you're made redundant, this you are siloed out of that community like that. You are pushed
Yeah.
out into the void, and oftentimes you are incommunicado. And that is really hard. So that's one
Hmm.
of the reasons why we started the Open to Work community, because you lose that community when you are and driving towards a North Star together is something you lose almost immediately when you start your job search. And so having those like extra moments, like checking, like put a reminder to check in your
Hmm.
on your diary like once a month or whatever, and how these people are doing and what you can do to help, or if not, or do you want to just grab a coffee? Like it, I can't tell you, it means so much to people. Um, and so once you've been told you're being made redundant as a candidate, what do you think they should do next or first? So you've signed your document or and you've completed your exit. What happens next in your mind? What do you think they should do next?
I think this is once again where I will say pause. I think if this is can be a really good moment for you to decide what do you want to do next. I think sometimes people have gotten into careers and they've just stayed in there because that was their career. So the next job, you're not passionate about it, you don't care about it. But I think with what we've all experienced from the 2020 market and things like that, we can actually work for our passions. We can do new things. Are you doing this because mom and dad just had you doing this forever before? Like, what does that look like for you? And I would say that's where I would challenge your beliefs. And this is where you get a chance to really know yourself. Where do you have your passions at? Is it still aligned in this way? Maybe it isn't. What about trying that new thing or learning about some other job functions? That can be really helpful. And also, where do you have transferable skills? The one thing that I always tell people to do is ask people about you. Like, what do they really enjoy working with you on? What is a skill that they really love that you have? We think we know a lot about ourselves. We don't. And so, like, other people can tell you things, and you're like, oh, wow, that's really surprising. Like, I didn't even think about that. And so, this is an opportunity for you to also learn about yourself, through the lens of others, because you will need that when you're interviewing, to kind of talk about yourself in this type of way. And it's validated in a point where you maybe feel your lowest, honestly. And so, I think it also kind of helps with the confidence as well as to how to position yourself in the market.
I really want to double click on all of that, but especially the pause. I remember I knew I was being made redundant, and I've talked about that many times in the past. But I remember the day I was made redundant, I had a interview for a role that was a straight step horizontally into another business that did almost the exact same thing, and it was the exact same role that I was currently doing. And I just absolutely chumped the interview. I remember really vividly. I was not prepared. I was not mentally
Mm-hmm.
focused. I was about to go in and receive my redundancy notice from my manager like about an hour later, and I really regret taking that interview. And so that moment of pause, I think, is really important. And I think let's just kind of leave on a final note, I guess, that this, if you're to take one thing away from this, is that this is a business decision. This isn't about you. And as someone who was made redundant, like in the past year or so, um, I really, even though I knew that I was a business
Mm-hmm.
person, I've been through this, I've done this before. It still took me so much mental legwork, and the amount of times, like months later, that I was like furious and like self-deprecating and challenging myself and reflecting back on these moments. It haunted me for
Mm-hmm.
a long time, even though I knew that it
Yeah.
wasn't me and it wasn't my performance that got me to that point. And so I know it's easy for us to say it, but I really want you to like take one thing away from this. If you're listening to this and you've been made redundant, it is not you, and do whatever you can to get yourself into that mental headspace that you are comfortable in knowing that deeply and within yourself, and that there is community out there for you to find and support you on your next role, whether or not you kind of want to, regardless of where you are in that search. And I just really encourage you to engage with that. It's not about you.
It's not about you. I love it.
Okay. Morgan, thank you so much for coming on today. That was super informative. There was a lot of like kind of quite dense content, but I think that almost like landed the point home in like the technicality of what's happening behind the scenes. And I think that that is really important. But then also thank you for sharing. Like you've been through so much, and I think a lot of people who've been impacted by some of the work that you've had to do as a result of your work probably have wouldn't have realized the hard work that you're doing behind the scenes to make sure this is done right for them and that they're being looked after in the right way. So thank you for the work you're doing.
Yeah, no. And honestly, I'm very happy. Like, if people have questions, happy to talk about it. I mean, this is a point where I really do want people to be empowered and seeing the behind the scenes and a lot of people not having that context to me, this is kind of where you can get some of that strength back. I'm in a moment where you feel super, super weak. So happy to be informative.
And where can we find you online if we want to learn more?
Please find me on LinkedIn. That is where I am the most active. But Morgan Williams, you can just find me on LinkedIn. And yeah, happy to send me a message. Please write a comment within the message so I will know. That will help me target it. But yes, that's helpful for me.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely recommend following Morgan. And if you're in the HR industry, check out Peak HR. It's an awesome community. We've been sharing a lot of notes as we've been building our own communities alongside each other. And I'm a big supporter. Speaking of which, if you are interested in joining the Open to Work community and you are looking for your community of job seekers who are all on the same mission to find their next job, you can join the Open to Work community at opentowork.community. It's a fun URL that causes me no end of issues that we are not going to change anytime soon, I think. And check out the article that will almost certainly be associated with this on Friday as well. So we've got so much free content for you, no matter where you are in the world and no matter where you are in your job search. We're here to help. So once again, Morgan, thank you so much for coming on today, and I'll talk to you soon.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me.